Every empire swears that its currency will stay strong forever. Every government insists that its promises will last for all time. But history disproves these assurances again and again. From Rome to France, from the Confederacy to modern Lebanon, countless societies have awakened one day to find their savings evaporated, their wages rendered meaningless, and the very systems they trusted quietly draining away their future. Collapse is not an exception. It is one of history's most predictable cycles. So the real question is not whether financial systems will fail, but how you will protect yourself when they do. That comforting illusion of "this will last forever" is one of the biggest traps in finance. We look at our bank balances, our national currencies, and assume they are solid as stone. But money is not a stone. Money is trust, and trust can vanish overnight. This is why history is both brutally harsh and incredibly instructive. Every collapse leaves behind clues, patterns, and warnings about what truly protects wealth and what turns to dust. If you pay attention, you'll notice something striking. Those who survive financial disasters are never the ones who trusted blindly. They were the ones who doubted first. Take the Eastern Roman Empire, what most people call Byzantium, which managed to survive for nearly 1,000 years after the Western Empire fell. At the heart of its economy was the gold solidus, a currency so reliable that merchants from Europe to the Middle East to Asia accepted it without question. For centuries, the solidus functioned almost like the global reserve currency of the medieval world. One would think they had learned from Rome's earlier disaster with the silver denarius, a currency emperors had debased until it became little more than a thin silver coating over tin. We've talked about that story before, and yet, astonishingly, centuries later the Byzantines repeated the very same mistake, this time with gold. They began shaving the purity of their coins, thinning them out, mixing in cheaper metals. At first no one noticed, but slowly confidence collapsed. The coin that once anchored Mediterranean trade became just another instrument of political manipulation. As its value eroded, so did the stability of the Byzantine economy. And what remained? Not government decrees, not promises written on paper. The survivors were the merchants who had quietly stored real gold or moved their wealth outside the empire. While everyone else watched their money evaporate, these few preserved their fortunes. And here emerges the first timeless lesson. Governments cannot resist the temptation to weaken their own currency. And when they do, real value flees into assets they cannot imitate. But not every collapse is caused by rulers manipulating money. Sometimes collapse comes from shocks no one sees coming. In the mid-14th century, Europe was struck by the most devastating pandemic in its history, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, nearly half the population perished. Cities emptied, villages disappeared, trade routes shut down. But economically, the plague created a far more complex reality. When half the labor force vanishes, the survivors suddenly become valuable. Workers demanded far higher wages. Food and land, once scarce, became relatively abundant. Families with silver, goods, or simply the ability to work found themselves with bargaining power they had never imagined. Land that once cost a fortune could now be bought for a fraction of its former price. Homes stood abandoned, fields left unplowed. Survivors found themselves in a massive buyer's market. If this sounds disturbingly familiar, it should. We witnessed a modern version during COVID. Supply chains collapsed, governments printed trillions to keep the machine running, and a massive wave of inequality followed. Those with liquidity seized assets. Those living paycheck to paycheck were left behind. In the United States, housing prices soared. stock markets recovered almost instantly, while millions struggled to pay rent. The pattern is unmistakable. Pandemics redistribute wealth. This has always been true. Black Death survivors climbed the social ladder. COVID-era survivors with cash-bought properties, stocks, and businesses others could no longer afford. The lesson is uncomfortable, but accurate. Crises reward those with reserves and punish those without. Pandemics show how fast an economy can be overturned, but the banking crash of Renaissance Florence reveals something just as critical. Even institutions that seem too big to fail can collapse like dominoes. In the 1340s, Florence was the financial capital of Europe, home to powerful banking dynasties like the Bardas and the Peruzzis. These families had lent enormous sums to monarchs, the most disastrous borrower being King Edward III of England, who defaulted during his wars with France. When Edward stopped paying, the banks collapsed, deposit holders were ruined, trade froze. Florence, once rich and mighty, plunged into chaos. The ordinary people who trusted the city's powerful banking families were confronted with a harsh truth. Size did not mean safety, and prestige offered no protection when a crisis struck. And what did this teach them? The idea of being too big to fail was one of the oldest and most dangerous myths in financial history. Because the true purpose of institutions is to generate profit, not to ensure the survival of individuals. So when these structures collapsed, the lifelong savings of ordinary people collapsed with them, crushed under the weight of the very institutions they relied on. This reality has repeated itself in every era, from the Great Collapse in Florence to the 2008 Lehman Brothers bankruptcy to the 2019 account freezes in Lebanese banks. And the ones who managed to survive were those who understood that institutional promises are valid only as long as everything is running smoothly. The American Civil War is remembered for battles, politics, and emancipation, but behind the gunpowder and speeches was a financial war most Americans still don't fully grasp. Both the Union and the Confederacy realized such a massive war required printing new money. In the North, the government issued paper currency not backed by gold, the greenbacks. At first it looked bold and patriotic, but the more greenbacks were printed, the less they bought. Inflation rose, confidence fell. The South had it even worse. The resource-strapped Confederacy, on the other hand, began printing staggering amounts of gray notes. By the end of the war, inflation in the Confederacy had reached almost unimaginable levels. Prices had increased thousands of times over, and wages could barely buy anything at all. Soldiers' paychecks were losing their value before they even had a chance to spend them. Families found themselves carrying bags full of money just to buy a single loaf of bread. By 1865, the Confederate currency was not just weak, it was completely dead. In this collapse, what mattered was not the promises written in paper, but tangible assets: land, food, gold. Anything with real intrinsic value, all gained strength, while the currency itself became a cruel joke. For ordinary Southerners, this was devastating. A lifetime of savings evaporated in an instant. For opportunists who could acquire real assets, the war became a rare chance to obtain property and wealth at a fraction of their former cost. And here is a truth very few Americans know, yet should never forget. This country has already experienced a full-scale currency collapse. And when it happened, the thing that offered protection was not the faith people placed in the paper they carried in their pockets. The problem wasn't the people, it was the system itself swelling until it destroyed its own value, and no one could stop it. A similar pattern emerged in France. which became one of the clearest examples of how revolutions can destroy a currency far faster than any war. In the 1790s, after the revolutionaries overthrew the monarchy and seized the church's lands, they introduced a new paper currency, the assignats. In theory, these banknotes were backed by the value of the confiscated properties and were supposed to stabilize the economy. But in practice, things unfolded very differently. The government began printing them recklessly. Each new issuance weakened the previous one a little more. Prices soared, wages couldn't keep up, and before long the assignats had become almost entirely worthless. Farmers refused to trade their food for these paper notes, demanding goods with real value, or silver instead. Bread riots erupted again in Paris, and the revolution collapsed under the weight of the economic disaster it had created. The winners of this chaos were not those walking around with piles of patriotic paper money. The real advantage belonged to those who held what the government could not print at will: food, gold, and solid property. For the ordinary Parisian, understanding the truth came far too late. No matter how noble they appeared, promises had value only as long as people continued to accept them. Once trust collapsed, your savings didn't slowly fade away, they vanished in an instant. And now, let's fast forward 2 centuries. The same lesson appears once again, this time in Asia. A speculative attack on the Thai baht in 1997 quickly spiraled into a crisis that engulfed the entire region. Thailand had borrowed massive amounts of dollars, trusting that its fixed exchange rate would hold. But when the currency collapsed, those foreign currency debts became impossible to repay almost overnight. As investors panicked and rushed out of the country, the shock spread like falling dominoes. Currencies across Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea, crashed one after another. Economies contracted, unemployment surged, and governments were forced to turn to the International Monetary Fund for help. And the ones who suffered the most were not the global hedge funds that sparked the panic. The real burden fell on ordinary people, those whose savings evaporated, whose mortgages doubled in cost, and whose jobs disappeared in an instant. And once again the same bleak pattern emerged, painfully familiar. Those who held dollars or assets abroad survived far better than those who trusted solely in their local currency. Countries dependent on foreign debt were forced into harsh austerity, while the major financial institutions on Wall Street took advantage of the chaos, buying valuable Asian assets for pennies on the dollar and emerging from the crisis even stronger. On the surface, it looked like a regional collapse, but behind the scenes it was a massive global transfer of wealth, and here the lesson reveals itself once again. From Byzantium to Argentina, every major collapse teaches the same truth. Borrowing in someone else's currency is a trap you dig for yourself. Because when the storm hits, the ones who drown are not the creditors, it's the debtors. At this point, the picture becomes impossible to ignore. Whether you look at revolutionary France, the American Civil War, or modern Asia, the same script repeats itself every time. Paper currency loses value and debt chains down both nations and families. And notice this well. The people who survive these collapses are never the ones who trust everything blindly. They're the ones who sense the fragility of the system before it falls apart. The most unsettling truth is this. These kinds of collapses did not remain trapped in the dusty pages of history. The very same process is happening right now, right in front of our eyes. Between 2019 and 2021, what happened in Lebanon turned something most people in developed countries would consider unthinkable into a harsh reality. The banks locked their doors. People woke up one morning to find their accounts frozen, withdrawal limits imposed, and their national currency in free fall. The Lebanese pound lost more than 90% of its value, collapsing almost entirely. Savings that had taken decades to accumulate evaporated in an instant. People lined up outside banks begging to access their own money, but most of the time the only answer they heard was, "There is no money." And this devastation didn't hit only small savers. Middle-class families, retirees, doctors, engineers, everyone who trusted the system met the same fate. The lesson was brutally clear. The money you keep in the bank is not a treasure chest. It is a loan you give to an institution that can refuse to return it in a crisis. Those who came out of the disaster in the best condition were the ones who diversified abroad, held real assets like gold or property, or kept cash outside the banking system. Everyone else was essentially trapped. This may seem like a far-fetched scenario, but in reality, it is anything but. In 2008, Americans were forced to watch as the very banks that caused the crisis were bailed out by the government, while their own homes were seized and their retirement savings evaporated. In 2020, when the pandemic erupted, trillions of dollars were printed to keep the system alive, a flood of money that inflated asset prices while ordinary wages remained stagnant. By 2023, as depositors began to lose confidence, regional banks in the United States collapsed almost overnight, reminding everyone of a harsh truth. The reliability of what we call too big to fail lasts only until the day the doors slam shut. So how do you protect yourself when everything falls apart? History has proven again and again that there is no single answer. In Byzantium, safety was in gold. After the Black Death, security depended on having enough liquidity to buy abandoned land. In Florence, survival meant refusing to blindly trust bankers deemed too big to fail. For the Confederacy, protection came from tangible physical assets. In France, salvation lay in food and property. In Asia, the key to survival was avoiding debt denominated in foreign currencies. And in Lebanon, the lesson was unmistakable. Those who managed to exit the system before the bank shut their doors were the ones who survived. Surviving economic collapse has never been about blind trust in paper or institutions. It has always come down to recognizing, before it's too late, what truly holds value when the system falls apart. And here lies the unsettling truth. Every collapse carries both destruction and opportunity. For those unprepared, it is pure disaster. But for those who remain resilient, those who hold cash, gold, or assets that cannot simply be printed, collapse becomes a moment of acquisition, a chance to obtain wealth at a fraction of its former price. This is exactly why peasants were able to become landowners after the Black Death. There was an abundance of land, but not enough people left to work it. And after the 2008 crisis, while hundreds of thousands lost their homes, those who held liquidity were able to buy properties for pennies on the dollar. History makes one thing very clear. Protection is not just about playing defense. True protection comes from positioning yourself to act when everyone else is forced to retreat. Likewise, preserving wealth is not only about what you own, but also about what you can do. Throughout history, the ones who truly survived were not just those with gold or land. It was those who could create value when others could not, and produce what the world still needed even in its darkest moments. A baker who can still produce bread, a craftsman who knows how to repair tools, a farmer who can feed an entire community, or a merchant who can move goods across borders. These were the people who not only survived collapses, but managed to rise within them. Because in every crisis, money loses its meaning, but production never does. People will always need to eat, build, trade, and continue life, and those who can meet these needs never remain poor in the long run. Real security does not lie in blindly attaching yourself to institutions or believing that governments or banks will one day save you. True protection is the combination of holding real assets, possessing practical skills, and understanding that every illusion eventually collapses. Because every crisis triggers an invisible shift of power, a transfer of value from the majority who hands over their trust without question, to the small minority who prepared in advance. A movement away from promises written on paper toward real, tangible, unforgeable value. A shift from passive savers to those who build, produce, and create. History has shown this cycle countless times, which is why the real question is not, will the system collapse? Because every system collapses eventually. The real question is this: when that moment arrives, will you be among the crowd holding nothing but promises, or among the small group holding real value in their hands? So, friends, just one piece of advice. In an uncertain future, no one can take precautions on your behalf. Strengthening your savings with real assets, the kind that cannot be printed or inflated away, is wiser today than it has ever been. And there's one more truth I want to leave you with, a truth often forgotten, yet perhaps the most important of all. A human being carries their greatest power not in the outside world, but deep within their own essence. All those patterns we were taught for years, the fears imposed on us, the dogmas repeated as that's how the system works, they are nothing but the traces of an unconscious mind. But the moment the mind awakens, the moment the invisible web we call the matrix begins to dissolve, a person remembers their worth, their ability to create, and their power to change direction. True freedom isn't found in perfect conditions on the outside, it's found in reclaiming the power within and choosing your own truth. Because that power is already inside you and it has no limit.